Hi, I'm Candace Vance. I oversee the research revenue cycle, particularly as it relates to clinical trials. So that is from pre-award before we start the trial through closing it out. But basically, I'm all things sort of financial and compliance, financial compliance as well. Next slide. So, what is the clinical trial? If you can click on that square for me, Tina. So this is the NIH definition of a clinical trial. So a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions. So this could be something as simple as you have just a blood draw as an intervention. That would be considered a clinical trial, and it does need to touch us. Still, your starting point, as everybody has mentioned, is your SCA. They will know best what offices it needs to touch. But just explaining why the importance of it is in a clinical trial setting. So the next block there. The reason it's important is because not many people are aware, but there are many requirements with human subject protection and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. All clinical trials also need to be approved by the IRB, which you'll hear more about later, and they need to receive something called a Medicare coverage analysis. And then in order to keep maintaining that compliance, we need to enter those clinical trials into our clinical trial management system to make sure that we're tracking that throughout the life of the trial. All of our policies related to this, if you click on that next box, will be in policy tech, and that will navigate through Starport. There are various categories because there are many different clinical trial requirements that fall into each category. So that will be the best place for you to go. And I can include the link when we follow up and send the slide deck out. Next slide. So this shows the clinical trial financial life cycle. So for anyone that knows anything about clinical trials, they are used to sort of the blue life cycle, which is where Ashton referred to the confidentiality disclosure agreement. We receive all of the documents from the sponsor, submit to the IRB, start it up, consent and enroll patients, and then track those visits, making sure that we're entering all the data for the sponsor, and then eventually closing out that. The orange here is sort of where I fall into and my team. So we have to perform that coverage analysis. I'll mention that in a minute. Identify the patients, register them correctly, make sure they're charged appropriately, code those appropriately, and process their claims and invoice those sponsors for reimbursement. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, we need to do a coverage analysis and budget negotiation. So, that ensures that items are billed to insurance or research as appropriate. So, at the very beginning of a study, my team reviews the protocol in its entirety and determines which procedures can be billed to insurance or cannot. So, a common question we get is if there is no funding, why would it need to go through revenue cycle? And this is exactly why. If the patient is having any type of intervention at all, even if we're not receiving funding, we need to make sure we're compliant with Medicare requirements. So in order to make sure we're staying compliant, we need to build this out in Encore, which is our clinical trial management system. Tracking our visits ensures billing compliance. We don't know that things are happening all across MedStar Health unless we have a central system where research teams can input those visits. In order to do that, we can make sure that the subjects are registered properly. So the patients will appear as on study in the electronic medical record when they are entered into Encore. There is an automated interface that tracks into our electronic health record and will help ensure patient safety as it relates to research. This will also help us in billing compliance. So the billing, and we ensure that the proper coding is on all Medicare claims and that revenue is recognized from our sponsors. When we appropriately adjudicate the charges, that is where we take a look at the whole account, see what charges happened, and then were they billed to the proper payer. Was any pre-authorization required? So did it need to go through our financial clearance department at MedStar Health? So that is where we also ensure that. And then overall internal quality assurance is just monitoring those visits on a daily basis and making sure that we've gotten all of those requirements on each bill.